in the fall of 1971 at a farm equipment auction outside of Granton, Ontario. A 38-year-old woman named Millicent Pryce paid $40 for a 1948 McCormick threshing machine that had no drum in it. Not a broken drum, not a seized drum, no drum at all. Someone had cut it out years ago, bolted up the housing, and left the shell sitting behind a barn where it collected wasp nests and regret. The auctioneer listed it last, the way auctioneers always list things they don't believe in. Last item, folks, 1948 McCormick separator, no threshing drum, no concave, no sieves. She's got a frame and a blower housing, and that's your lot. Somebody give me $20 for the sheet metal. A scrap buyer from Wingham raised his hand. 25? Millicent said. The scrap buyer looked at her, the way men at farm auctions looked at women who bid on broken machinery. He shrugged and sat down. 25 was already more than the steel was worth. Nobody else moved. Millicent loaded the hollow McCormick onto her husband's old flatbed and drove the 40 minutes back to Huron County in the early October cold. She passed the co-op implement dealer on the edge of Roxeter, where Frank Dempsey was standing outside talking to two farmers who'd come in from the Blythe Road. Frank saw the gutted separator on the flatbed and did what men like Frank Dempsey always do when they see something they don't understand. He laughed. He was still laughing when he leaned inside and told the parts man, Millicent Pryce just came through with a threshing machine that's got no drum in it. Bought it at the Granton sale, apparently. Paid cash money for a tin box with a blower fan. The parts man shook his head. What's she going to do with it? Frank said, same thing she does with everything else nobody wants. Nothing, probably. By the end of that week, the joke had made the rounds of every elevator and feed store between Wingham and Listowel. Millicent Pryce bought a thresher with no drum. What's next? A baler with no plunger, a combine with no cutter bar. The jokes came easy. They always do. When a quiet woman does something the loud men can't explain. Let me tell you about Millicent Pryce, because what she put inside that hollow McCormick is one of the most remarkable pieces of farm engineering ever done in Huron County. And it only makes sense if you understand the woman who did it. Millicent was born in 1933 in Turnberry Township, the second daughter of a Finnish immigrant named Eno McKinnon, who had come to Ontario in 1924 and cleared 40 acres of bushland north of Belgrave that nobody else had wanted. Eno was a millwright by trade. He'd worked in the paper mills outside of Tampere from the age of 15, and he understood machinery the way some men understand weather, intuitively, in the bones, before the logic catches up. He came to Canada with a set of precision files, a dial indicator, and the knowledge that good millwright work is invisible. When a machine runs perfectly, nobody notices. When it fails, everyone asks why you didn't fix it sooner. Eno never made much from farming. The Turnberry ground was heavy clay, poorly drained, slow to warm in spring. But he ran a small millwright business out of the shop he built behind the farmhouse, and that shop became the most important room in Millicent's childhood. By the time she was 10, she could pack a bearing. By 14, she could true a shaft on the lathe her father had bought from a Goderich machine works that went bankrupt during the war. By 17, she understood power transmission, belt ratios, shaft speeds, bearing loads, the way most farm girls understood bread recipes and canning schedules. Eno had a saying he repeated so often it became the rhythm of the shop. If it moves, it has a speed. If it has a speed, you can change it. If you can change it, you can make it do what you need. He wasn't talking about tractors. He was talking about everything. Millicent married Harold Pryce in 1955. Harold farmed 200 acres south of Bluevale and was a decent man and a competent farmer, but he was not a machinist. He bought equipment from dealers, paid on time, and when things broke, he called for parts. When Harold died of a stroke in the winter of 1969, he left Millicent the farm, the old Ford tractor, a worn-out combine that needed a new feeder house, and $4,200 in the bank. He left no debt, which was more than most farmers in Huron County could say, but he also left no margin. Millicent was 36 years old, farming alone, with $4. 202 years until her son would be old enough to help with anything serious. She could not afford new equipment. She could not afford to hire custom operators for every job. She needed a threshing machine that worked, and she needed it for less than she had in the bank. That was why she drove to Granton on a Tuesday in October 1971 and paid $40 tin box, that a hollow tin laugh that made Frank Dempsey inside it. She already knew what she was going to put inside it. 6 weeks before the Granton auction, Millicent had driven out to a municipal road allowance sale near Teeswater, where the county was clearing a maintenance yard. Among the items were 3 industrial grain handling components that had been pulled from a feed mill that closed in 1967. One of them was a Dion cylinder and concave assembly, the threshing mechanism from a 1950s-era Dion combine that had been removed when the mill upgraded its cleaning equipment. The cylinder was intact. The concave was intact. The rasped bars were worn but serviceable. The entire assembly was bolted to a subframe that someone had built for it, clearly intending to reinstall it somewhere, and then never did. Millicent knew the Dion cylinder. Her father had serviced one in 1961 for a farmer near Fordwich, and Millicent had helped him align the concave clearance. The cylinder was simple, robust, and effective. It was also designed to be driven by a standard flat belt from a tractor power takeoff, the same tractor PTO that every McCormick separator from that era used. She paid $65 for it. $65 for a complete threshing mechanism that, in working condition inside a functioning machine, represented the core value of a separator that cost $2,000 new. The problem was the housing. The Dion cylinder was 4 inches wider and 3 inches taller than the original McCormick drum it would need to replace. It would not fit inside the existing McCormick housing without modification. It had a different inlet angle, different discharge geometry, and different bearing mounts than the machine it was going into. But Millicent had already been measuring for 2 months. She'd gotten the specifications for both machines from their service manuals, the McCormick manual from her father's files, the Dion manual from the Ontario Agricultural Library in Guelph, where she'd driven specifically for that purpose. She'd drawn the clearances by hand on graph paper at the kitchen table after the boys were in bed. She knew exactly what needed to change. She paid $40 for the shell in Granton. She already had the mechanism in her shop. Now came the work. And the work, as Millicent understood it, was not mechanical. The mechanics were solved on paper before the first cut was made. The work was patience, precision, and the willingness to start over if the measurement said to start over. She opened the McCormick housing along the upper seam, cutting with a torch along lines she'd scribed in chalk. She modified the inlet throat, widening it by 4 inches and reshaping the sheet metal with the English wheel her father had built from a post and a piece of scaffold pipe, a tool that cost nothing and did work that would have cost $40 an hour from a body shop. She fabricated new bearing mounts from flat plate, drilling and tapping them on the drill press, then welding them to the modified frame at the angles the graph paper said they needed to be. The concave adjustment mechanism was the hardest part. The McCormick used a hand crank system to set concave clearance. The Dion used a different geometry entirely. Millicent designed an intermediate bracket, a three-piece linkage that converted the McCormick's crank motion into the angular adjustment the Dion concave required. She made it from cold rolled bar stock, machined the pivot points on the lathe, and pinned the assembly with hardened bolts she'd salvaged from a broken cultivator frame. It took her 11 days to get it right. On the 12th day, she cranked the handle, and the concave moved cleanly from tight to open with no binding and no slop. She fabricated a new drive arrangement, a jackshaft running across the top of the housing, driven by a flat belt from the McCormick's original input pulley, with a crossed belt down to the Dion cylinder. The jackshaft gave her speed reduction. The original McCormick input was sized for a tractor running at 540 PTO, which would have driven the Dion cylinder too fast. With the jackshaft, she could run the cylinder at the speed the Dion was designed for while using the standard tractor hookup. She turned the jackshaft on her father's lathe from a piece of cold finished round stock. The pulleys she pulled from the bone pile in the corner of the shop, 2 from a worn-out grain elevator, 1 from a pump drive that hadn't run since Harold bought the farm. 3 months, every night after supper, every Saturday. Sundays when the weather was bad and the boys were quiet. In January of 1972, Millicent rolled the finished machine out of the shop on a day when the temperature was -18 and the snow was packed hard enough to drive on. She hooked the old Ford tractor to the McCormick's input shaft, engaged the PTO at low throttle, and listened. The cylinder came up to speed with a sound that was wrong for a McCormick. Lower, smoother, with a different harmonic than the original drum. It sounded like machinery that had been thought about carefully, which it had. Millicent brought the tractor up to full PTO speed and held it there for 20 minutes, listening for vibration, watching the bearing housings for heat, checking the belt tension by feel. Nothing moved that shouldn't. Nothing ran hot. The concave adjustment worked at speed exactly as it had worked on the bench. She fed a bucket of old wheat through the inlet by hand to check the threshing action. The cylinder took it cleanly, and the grain came out of the discharge without cracking. She adjusted the concave 1 click tighter and ran another bucket. Better. She found the setting in less than an hour, the kind of calibration that took some custom operators all morning. The machine worked, not adequately, not serviceably. It worked better than the original. The original McCormick Super, with its factory drum, was rated for handling approximately 600 bushels of wheat per day under Ontario conditions. The Dion cylinder, with its larger diameter and higher rasp bar speed, moved grain faster and separated cleaner. When Millicent ran the modified machine in the fall of 1972, her neighbor's son, who operated a custom threshing rig and knew his numbers, timed her throughput at something closer to 800 bushels in a long day. $40 for the shell, $65 for the cylinder. Call it another $30 in steel, belts, and hardware. $135 total. A new McCormick separator was some $1,900 at the dealer in Wingham. A decent used one, in working condition, was $600 to $800. Frank Dempsey heard about it, as Frank Dempsey always heard about things. One of the farmers who'd had Millicent thresh for him that fall mentioned the throughput numbers at the implement counter. Frank said the numbers were wrong. The farmer said he'd stood there himself and watched. Frank said the machine must have been set wrong, that you couldn't get those numbers out of a rebuilt wreck. The farmer said he'd timed it himself with his watch. Frank drove out to the Pryce farm on a Wednesday in November. He found Millicent in the shop, replacing the drive belts for winter storage. She didn't hear his truck over the noise of the radio, and Frank stood in the doorway for a moment watching her work before she noticed him. He walked around the machine slowly, the way a man walks around something that shouldn't exist. He crouched down and looked at the cylinder housing. He checked the concave linkage. He followed the jackshaft arrangement with his eyes from input to output, tracing the belt path, working out the speed ratios in his head. "That's a Dion cylinder," Frank said finally. "That's right. Inside a McCormick housing. That's right." He looked at the jackshaft. "You step down the input speed. The Dion runs slower than the McCormick drum. I needed a jackshaft to get the ratio right." Frank crouched down again and looked at the concave adjustment. "This linkage, this is your own design?" "The Dion concave adjusts on a different geometry than the McCormick crank. I built an intermediate linkage." Frank was quiet for a moment. He touched the pivot point on the intermediate bracket. "That's machined on my father's lathe." Frank stood up. He looked at the machine for a long time without saying anything. Then he looked at Millicent. "I told people you'd bought yourself a tin box," he said. Millicent set down her wrench. "Yes, I heard." Frank Dempsey had been selling farm equipment in Huron County for 14 years. He'd sold Millicent nothing, because Millicent bought nothing from dealers when she could build it cheaper. He'd considered her, in the way that dealers consider people who don't buy from them, as someone slightly outside the normal operation of things. Not wrong, exactly. Just not relevant to his business. He was reassessing. "What did the whole thing cost you?" $135. Maybe $140 with the fuel for the torch. Frank made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "I've got a new McCormick on the floor at $1,900. I've got a used one, decent shape, at $750. Millicent picked up her wrench again. "I know. I priced them both before I started." "How long did it take to build?" 3 months. Evenings and weekends." Frank put his cap back on. His expression had changed from the careful neutrality that implement dealers maintain to something more uncomfortable. He was not a man who admitted things easily, but he was also not a fool, and the machine in front of him was not the work of a fool. "Millicent, this is better than what the factory sent out." "My father used to say that a factory makes what it can sell to everyone," Millicent said. "A millwright makes what works for her." Frank drove home. He didn't mention the visit to anyone, which was unusual for Frank Dempsey, who mentioned most things to most people, but there was nothing to say that didn't make him look like he'd been standing in the wrong place for 14 years. The Pryce farm ran on that rebuilt McCormick for the next 11 years without a major repair. The Dion cylinder, which had already spent 15 years in a feed mill before Millicent bought it, ran another decade inside the modified housing without losing a rasp bar or cracking a concave. Millicent kept her maintenance schedule on a card tacked to the shop wall, bearing grease at 50 hours, belt inspection at every use, concave clearance check at the start of each harvest season. Simple things, done on time. The machine never asked for more than that. She threshed for 3 neighbours during those years, not as a business exactly, as an arrangement. They brought grain, she ran the machine. They helped with the farm work she couldn't manage alone. The old way, which was also the sensible way, which were often the same thing in Huron County, if you paid attention. Her costs stayed what they were. The $140 machine didn't have payments. The farm Harold had left her had no mortgage. The shop had no overhead beyond hydro and the occasional piece of steel from the Wingham metal supplier. When grain prices fell in the late 1970s, Millicent tightened a belt she'd already kept fairly tight and kept farming. In the spring of 1981, the Hendricks place came up for sale. 80 acres adjacent to Millicent's north fence, Same clay ground, same modest drainage, same flat Huron County light falling across it in the morning. The Hendricks family had farmed it for 30 years, but the son had gone to Kitchener for work and wasn't coming back, and the parents were ready to be done. The asking price was $420 an acre. Millicent bid $430. A land investor from London who'd been buying Huron County parcels pushed her to $450. Millicent went to $460. The investor bid $470. Millicent said $480. The investor sat back and looked at her across the auction table the way people look at someone who seems to have more money than the situation suggests. He let it go. $480 an acre, 80 acres, $38,400. Cash. The auctioneer confirmed the payment, and the room went the particular quiet that farm auction rooms go when the outcome is not what anyone expected. The people who'd known Millicent Pryce as the woman who bought a broken thresher for $40 were now watching her sign a check for $38,000 as if it were a grocery bill, which, in the arithmetic of a farm run without debt and without wasted money for 11 years, it more or less was. Frank Dempsey was at the auction. He'd come to look at a parcel 2 lots down that one of his customers was interested in, but the news about the Hendricks place moved through the room fast. Frank made his way over to Millicent outside after the paperwork. $38,000 cash, Frank said. That's right. Frank was 61 years old by then, and he'd seen a lot of farm auctions. He thought he'd understood them. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at Millicent the way you look at an equation you've been reading wrong. For years. I've been selling equipment in this county since 1957, Frank said. I never sold you a thing. No, I used to think that meant you couldn't afford it. Millicent smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that doesn't need an audience. It meant I didn't need it. Frank was quiet. He looked at the sky over the Hendricks fields, her fields. Now, the way farmers look at land they've just understood differently. That thresher, Frank said, the rebuilt one. How many seasons has it run now? 11. And the cylinder? Still original. The die-on cylinder I put in 71. Same rasp bars reconditioned twice. The concave I rebuilt myself in 76 because the wires were wearing. Otherwise, it's the machine I built. Frank nodded slowly. What is that in hours? He asked. Millicent thought about it. Somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 hours of threshing work. Frank made the same sound he'd made in the shop 11 years earlier. Not quite a laugh. Something between understanding and the specific discomfort of understanding too late. The machine I sell, the equivalent capacity machine, Frank said, you're looking at an overhaul at 15,500 hours. Major rebuild at 2,500. By 3,000 hours most operators are talking trade-in. I know. I priced the parts before I built my own. Frank extended his hand. Millicent, I owe you an apology. In 1971, I told everyone who'd listen that you'd bought yourself a useless tin box. I said you couldn't know what you were doing. She shook his hand. People say that about things they don't understand, Frank. I should have known better. I watched what you built. I came out and saw the machine. I didn't say anything to anyone after that, but I should have said something to you. What you did in that shop was better than what came out of the factory. It's still running, while machines I sold are sitting in the hedgerow rusting. My father taught me, Millicent said. He believed that the best machinery is the kind built for a specific job, not the kind built for a general market. Your father was right. He usually was. Millicent farmed the combined 280 acres through the 1980s and into the early 1990s. Her son Andrew, who had grown up in the same shop she'd grown up in, who had learned to pack a bearing at 9 and turn a shaft at 14, came back to the farm after 2 years, working a machine shop in Guelph. He brought skills she hadn't had at his age, and she taught him the ones she had. And between them they kept the equipment running so quietly that neighbors sometimes forgot they owned a threshing machine at all, because they never heard it break down. The rebuilt McCormick ran its last harvest in 1993. Not because it failed, because Andrew had sourced a larger capacity machine through an estate sale in Gray County, and the old McCormick was simply surplus to what the farm needed. It sat in the north bay of the shop for 2 years, still in the condition Millicent had maintained it to, until a young farmer from Roxeter came looking for a separator, and Millicent sold it to him for $400. He ran it for 7 more years. In the summer of 2001, the Huron County Agricultural Society asked Millicent if she would bring the rebuilt McCormick to the county fair in Goderich for a working display. She said the machine was sold and running on another farm, but she'd build a scale model of the concave linkage if they wanted something to show. They did. She built it over the winter from scrap bar stock, machined to the same tolerances as the original, painted it the same green-gray as the McCormick housing. She put it in a display case with a hand-lettered card that read, "Intermediate concave adjustment linkage, fabricated by Millicent Pryce, Bluevale, Ontario, 1971, designed to adapt a Dion threshing cylinder to a McCormick separator housing, built on a lathe acquired by Eno McKinnon, Tampere, Finland, 1919. Total material cost of complete machine conversion, $140. Machine operational life, 22 years. Approximately 3,800 threshing hours. Now operating on a second farm. Below that, smaller, Eno McKinnon, 1901 to 1968. Millwright. Frank Dempsey came through the display on the Saturday afternoon. He was 75 and retired, moving slowly, and he stopped in front of the case for a long time without saying anything. His grandson was with him, a boy of about 12, who wanted to know what the linkage did. Frank explained it to him, correctly, in the language of a man who had sold farm machinery for 30 years, and finally understood what he'd been looking at all along. When the boy wandered off to find the tractor pulls, Frank stood alone in front of the case. $140, Frank said. Millicent was standing nearby. She'd been watching without making herself obvious. That's right. Frank shook his head slowly. I sold machines for $1,900 that didn't last as long. I sold machines for $6,000 that needed an overhaul before the third harvest. And this thing, this linkage you built in a shop in Bluevale in 1971, is still described on a card as operational. It's on a different farm now, but yes. Frank looked at the card again. He read the part about Eno McKinnon. Your father never charged enough for his millwright work, Frank said. I know that because I heard men say so at the time, and I never once heard them mean it as a criticism. Millicent said, he wasn't building a business. He was building things that worked. There's a difference. There is. Frank turned to go. Then he stopped. What do you see, Millicent? He said. When you look at something broken that everyone else has given up on, what do you actually see? She thought about it for a moment, the way a person thinks about something they've known for so long it's become difficult to translate. I see what it was built to do, she said, and I think about whether it could still do it, or whether it could do something better, if you understood what you actually needed. Most things that people throw away aren't broken, they're just misunderstood. Frank nodded. He put his cap on. Your father must have been a hell of a millwright, he said. The best in Turnberry Township, Millicent said, and she meant it the way she'd always meant it. Not as sentiment, but as a statement of fact, the kind her father had taught her to trust above everything else, above opinion, above reputation, above what the dealer said was possible. Fact was the only thing that didn't change depending on who was looking at it. The lathe Aino McKeenan had brought from Finland was still in the shop in Bluevale. Andrew's daughter, who was 11, had learned to fill a piece of bar stock on it the previous spring. She'd needed 3 tries to get the surface finish her mother required, and on the 3rd try she got it right, and she understood something about patience and measurement, and what it means to make a thing correctly the first time you do it correctly. The McCormick was somewhere in Huron County, threshing someone's grain, built for $140 in a cold shop in 1971, by a woman who saw not a tin box but a housing waiting for the right mechanism, a problem waiting for the right solution, a machine waiting to become what it actually needed to be. Everything else, as Frank Dempsey finally understood standing in a county fair display tent at 75 years old, was just the noise of people who hadn't learned to look.